feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled TIFF review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Go ahead.
Yes, today we are reviewing David Mackenzie's Relay, which just literally moments ago premiered at the, was it a world premiere as well?
I believe so. It hasn't played anywhere else during the festival season. This is literally the first time it's played for audiences. I believe there have been some critics that saw it beforehand for review purposes, but in terms of screening for a festival audience,
this was the world premiere. It literally just ended. They might still be doing the Q&A as we speak.
With a beardless David Mackenzie.
I know, he did. He might have had some like a short beard, but the nice thick.
He's looking more clean cut.
Yeah. It's day four, right?
Beardless.
Eric, how are you feeling? We did record some reviews last night, and we were both feeling a little rough yesterday. I got a good sleep last night, so I'm feeling much better today, although I can't kick this cough, so I feel bad for everyone around me during a movie.
And you should, Matt. I mean, you are part of the problem. You know, I think you have to go to a pharmaceutical company to find the right prescription for you.
Yes, exactly. But how are you doing?
You know, I'm fine, other than saying beardless. I think it's one of those things where it comes and goes in terms of, you know, picking up energy, and, you know, you feel like you're on your second or third wind. And, you know, watching Relay, it was kind of exciting because there's a part of this movie that is so engaging in that old school, you know, 70s and 80s paranoid thriller. You know, you think of The Parallax View, you think of 3 Days in the Condor, you know, movies like that, you know, are classically made and all about the writing and the integral nature of how, you know, precision and observation play roles, but how character dynamics, and even something like Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, the idea that someone could always be watching you and you have to
this cat and mouse kind of game too,
you know, strip the walls and floor to make sure that you're not being wiretapped, you know? And so, this is one of those, you know, classically made dramas for grownups that don't really see the light of day in the theatrical space anymore. So watching this with an audience in a theater was truly a joy. And this is where the but is coming in. The third act betrays the rest of the film. And it's unfortunate, and it's not dismissing the movie entirely, because it's not like we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's still a lot to really like, and we'll get into it soon. I think probably we should avoid talking too much about the plot per se, because I think part of the joy of watching this movie,
I had no idea what it was about, really.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of, you know, the nature of these kinds of stories, where you're sucked in and you are kind of, you know, with the protagonist as they, you know, go through the twists and turns of a narrative that is very much about always looking at different angles and seeing, you know, where the truth lies in a way, and, you know, who has the upper hand in any situation. We
will say, if you're not familiar with David Mackenzie, he is the director of Hell or High Water, probably best known for that. He did have Outlaw King at TIFF a few years ago, which was the opening night film. I was excited for this because I love Hell or High Water. I didn't know much about this other than Riz Ahmed, Lily James. You know, I knew it was some sort of thriller. I thought it was a heist movie, to be honest, before we saw the movie.
I did as well.
Kind of. But but you described it perfectly as this kind of paranoid, retro techno thriller kind of thing, using technology, but then also just like, what I mean by retro is like using the post office and all these old school surveillance tactics and all these kind of things.
Or even going to like computer, you know, lounges and things like that, instead of like always staying at home and being isolated. It is getting back in the world.
And it is a movie that takes place in modern day, but it does feel like it's set in New York and New Jersey, and it should have this kind of gritty feel, and it does to an extent. And I completely agree with everything you just said. I think for 90% of this movie, I was locked the fuck in. I was like, I am enjoying every second of this. It is a slow burn thriller, but it is completely and utterly engaging. I was brought into a world that I didn't even know could exist, right? Like this kind of blackmail and intrigue and like espionage and like through pharmaceutical companies and all this kind of stuff. And you hear about these things of cover-ups and, you know, all this kind of stuff, bribing people, NDAs. Like we've all kind of, I mean, even working at big companies, when I've been laid off and things like that, they make you sign NDAs and I, you know.
Well, the Insider, Michael Mann's The Insider is all about that, right? Yeah. Where, you know, it's about, you know, signing that form. But in the case of that movie, you know, Russell Crowe's character is having, you know, crisis of conscience and wanting to tell the truth about big tobacco being, you know, a cause of cancer.
And that is something we've seen a lot, but the way that this movie handles it in like a modern sense, but then using this relay technology, and I won't go too much into it, but it's like this third party system that protects the people on each side, but then adds this kind of unique sort of thing between, you know, Riz Ahmed has like basically a silent performance for the first half of the movie because of it. And again, I don't want to go too much into it because I still will suggest people go see this. But yeah, I think throughout, just at every set piece and every moment of this cat and mouse game that's being played and the relationship between the two leads, and like there's a great sequence in an airport and in Times Square, and like I can point out all these great ones where it always kept me guessing of where it was going and how the characters would get out of that situation. And it was always, and we said adult, and it just felt like it treated its audience with respect up until those last 15 minutes and was smart and clever. And you're like, oh, fuck, this is really cool. Every time where you're like, well, how is he going to get away with this? Or how is he going to turn the tides? And you put it when we were walking over here of like putting the prey. So
the predators being like the people that are working for the pharmaceutical company and spying on those that are either trying to do the right thing or protect themselves. We've seen this in movies many times before where, you know, their lives are threatened for whatever reason, but almost seeing those characters become the prey and become vulnerable and become the ones that are being targeted by this middleman. And I think like the idea of, you know, the moderator or the intermediate in Riz Ahmed's performance and in his character and what he does, you know, being nicely paralleled to you know, this company. It works perfectly, and everything feels smartly laid out. And just watching characters obsess over things and be very good at what they do in the process is always exciting. And I think it actually works really, really well in terms of talking about how addiction works, right? In terms of how we take, you know, if somebody has an addiction to something, what happens usually, not always, but you know, I've watched interviews with recovering addicts where they'll talk about they take their former addiction, whether it be substance abuse, alcohol,
something that was hurting them.
Yes, and then but then they transfer it to something else. So
that doesn't necessarily
hurt them, but maybe still isn't healthy for them in the sense of like being a workaholic. I know there's one chef in particular who used to do a food show called Bizarre Foods, Andrew Zimran, and he talks a lot about that, where you kind of just transfer one addiction to another. And even though it's not
and even
alcohol,
it's not physically hurting you, it might physically hurt you because you obsess over it and become addicted to work or whatever it is.
And even if you're doing it for the right reasons, you get so deep into it that you don't know which way is up anymore. And that's also really
interesting with Riz Ahmed's character in this. Great supporting cast. I think Lily James is great. Jake Sully himself is probably the lead antagonist in the movie. And I think he's serviceable, but like in a good way. I don't mean that as
he's a good, heavy and intimidating and used in a way that's, you know, I think as an antagonist, as somebody that can scowl and, you know, be in the background but look menacing, works really well. I think probably it is one of his better performances.
Yeah.
And he's intimidating, and that really works.
And his whole group of like thugs, I kind of really liked.
You have Jared Abramson, who's probably known in Canada for a really wonderful role in Hello Destroyer. Willa Fitzgerald, who had a breakout role late this summer with Strange Darling, has a small role as this group. And that's also just interesting as well, because the way that you have this core group of antagonists kind of chasing after or spying on Lily James, it kind of shows, like, you know, these people, like we were talking about with Enora, these people are also, you know, the intermediates, the middlemen, you know, and seeing how like leverage plays a role in this, I think is also just really well done, because in a way how the tables are turned on them with the predator and the prey metaphor again. And you feel as though you're watching a movie that knows the stakes and knows the genre so well and knows the ins and outs, to the point where it avoids cliches and tropes until that goddamn third act, and where it's almost like it's afraid to be that
commit or something like
intricate and well designed, and then it just is like it falls apart.
Yeah, the whole movie is very clever, and you almost want that. You don't need it to have that kind of, like you said, cliched action thriller, shoot 'em up kind of like, you know, confrontation. Yeah, and it kind of just falls into that at the end, and then. I don't want to say too much about that final act, other than we were both on the exact same page where we were locked in, and it's only really the last 10-15 minutes of the movie, maybe not even. But it's such a bummer, because everything before that is so entertaining and so engaging,
and even funny at times in terms of how, you know, Riz Ahmed's character knows all the angles to play this.
And unfortunately it sort of just falls apart, and it, like, to such an extent where it like literally drives off of a cliff, and like it's such a shame, because like I want to suggest this movie to people. I really
we still will,
and I will. I think I'll ultimately, once I think I've eased on, like we were recording right after we get out of the screening. I think if you ask me in a day or two, I'll probably maybe even be a bit softer on those last 10 minutes. I think it's just the initial, like, fuck, I really liked that movie up until the last 10 minutes. Because a movie shouldn't be held on, you know, sure, it couldn't stick the landing per se, but like everything before that, I think, is really, really good. And
the look, I think, is another thing we should talk about as well, with the cinematography, because even though it is modern, it's reflecting a very specific genre that was popular in the 70s and early 80s and taking place in New York. It needs a graininess to it.
It needs a grittiness, but it's so clean looking,
slick, and you know,
clinical. But
but you can still be clinical and be shot on film.
Yeah, we've seen Fincher movies and things like that. Or no, I mean, I've meant digitally. You can still have a grittiness while still not even faux grain, because there's some, you know, I think that still have that really clean look, but I think it's just. The lighting, I think, is a big part of that, to make it moody or like emulate some of these movies in an era that you're talking about, where this is just everything's in focus, everything's very bright and well lit, and like it doesn't have a lot of style in that sense. Like it just feels very straightforward and very clean, very 4K, very, you know,
like you're watching it on a streaming service. Because there's a shot in this movie. Because I think as well, like you mentioned it already, that Riz Ahmed's performance, for the most part, it's very silent, minimalist in terms of dialogue. And I mean, the guy's a fucking movie star, you know, in every sense of the word, where he can just capture your interest and hold it by a glance, you know, and you know when he's in control and when he's losing it and when he's having second doubts, but you're always with him, and it's very similar. And I think to something like Ryan O'Neal in The Driver, and then Ryan Gosling in Drive, right, where you're just drawn into his world and into his orbit in such a fascinating way. And the shot that I really love, and I think like this is also emulating that style of filmmaking and someone like Michael Mann as well, is there's a specific phone call that's made, and the shot of him that you see him sitting in a car with his back towards the camera, but his eyes in the rear view mirror. And that shot is like a classic, like 1970s spy paranoid thriller, down and dirty on the streets of New York kind of shot. And if it was a little bit more textured or a little bit more grainy throughout the film, I think it would add just a little bit more character to it, because I think the polish almost strips it away of a certain style that it's emulating.
Yeah, I absolutely 1,000% agree with that as well. It's the first thing I noticed as the movie started. It didn't, like, right when it started, I like the opening sequence. We should mention Victor.
Victor Garber. And I'm going to look up the last name. So I believe we should also just say the screenwriter is Justin Piasecki. And this is, he's done some work before, but really this is a coming out party, because I'm looking at his credits now. He did additional literary material for Expendables 4. So I mean, what a step up from that. I mean, good for him. But Matthew Marr, who I think a lot of people will know from the original High Fidelity. He's in a ton of Ben Affleck movies, more recently Air.
Good character actor.
Really solid character actor, very believable, everyday guy, you know?
And that opening, I was hooked from that opening sequence, but even with that establishing shot to that opening sequence, I'm like, I don't like the look of this movie.
Well, there is another thing that took me out of the film momentarily, and I think you know what it is. We both laughed at it. We talked about it before, where product placement plays a role sometimes and it distracts you.
Yeah.
But when it's fake product placement, or when it's
there's a couple moments like that.
Work link up, which is linked in, basically. Now they were showing Facebook as well, but they never showed like a logo.
And it looked like Facebook.
But when you see work,
I would have preferred them to just have it look like LinkedIn and not have a name.
And not have a logo there. But I could not stop laughing at that.
I hate that shit. Just use.
Would you like
products.
a can of Moke?
Yeah, I hate that shit. But those are just nitpicks. But I think overall, I do think it doesn't have distribution yet.
Well, Elevation Pictures has it here in Canada,
but they'll have to wait until they're
American distribution, and I think even international distribution, it'll get picked up. It will. I mean, David Mackenzie, you mentioned Hell or High Water,
just
The
on
Outlaw
that alone,
King,
right? Yeah.
But he also directed this really great prison drama with Ben Mendelsohn and Jack O'Connell called Startup, and it is.
I should watch that. Yeah.
Like that also is just like a gritty. Subversive look at sort of prison life, and it takes some really unexpected turns, and I think David Mackenzie, and I think he'd probably even admit this, like he's just like a solid journeyman director. Like if he has a really good script to work with, he can make it sing, and most of this does. And you are really like, I got more out of this in terms of entertainment and feeling like I was reading a great pulpy novel than I did Conclave.
Yeah.
In terms of the mystery, the intrigue, it doesn't stick the landing, but I think there's so much to.
But neither does Conclave.
No, but Conclave shits the bed as the Pope dies in the first shot. And we'll talk about that more in a review. But with this, I think there is a lot to admire, even if it isn't the next great, paranoid thriller. It's just a really solid addition to the genre.
Yeah, and I would definitely highly suggest checking it out whenever it does get picked up. And then, we mentioned if you're from Canada, Elevation will release it theatrically here, unless a streamer picks it up. But then they usually still release it theatrically, like with Hitman and things like that happened earlier.
And another shout out to Riz Ahmed for continuing to support the hearing impaired and deaf community in ways that it's not just simply like him trying to look good in terms of getting an Oscar nomination for Sound of Metal. Like he's really representing a community here. in a really thoughtful and actually very funny scene between him and a contact that he has and technology that he's using as well. So there's a lot of great stuff in this movie, even though the third act does fall apart. And I made the joke too, but not since Dana Carvey in Master of Disguise has there been a great sort of Lon Chaney, kind of character actor that can disappear into roles like Riz Ahmed. But that also, I think, even though that might be a little sillier compared to everything else in the movie, it's it did
garner some laughs in the theater.
Yeah, but you know what? Suspension of disbelief, because you give Tom Cruise the benefit of the doubt when he's doing it in a Mission Impossible movie. Give Riz.
I agree. I just think when a movie's trying to be so grounded and realistic and gritty that we're talking about, I think sometimes when a character shows up in a disguise, it just feels, I think we just don't think of that happening in real life or whatever. Yeah. But I think it mostly works. Even if you initially laugh, like Riz Ahmed is so great that you kind of lose that right away and you buy into him, using these disguises. And it does feel silly at first, but again, suspension of disbelief, like you said, or just like, I don't know. I was so engrossed in the world that they were building, right? And whether this is based off real shit that could happen or if it's just this sensationalized kind of version of it.
Well, I'm sure there are, like companies that like maybe because they talk about, whistleblower companies.
Yeah, and scare tactics and intimidation. Like that shit all does happen.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's companies like this that were middlemen trying to help people who are whistleblowers and stuff like that. But the way that they build this world, I was so engrossed with it for 90% of it. And not to get too much into that last act, but to explain ourselves a little bit, like everything before it is so smart and clever and doesn't fall into those cliches of like having to be an action movie or having to have guns and car chases and like all that, like, a shootout in the middle of the street.
It's all about
like, choices
made, right? And what you decide to omit and what you don't. And if you follow the instructions, always follow the instructions. I think that's becoming a theme of this festival because the substance is a little bit like that too, where it's like you need to follow the instructions to a T. And that's the thing that's really clever about it, is because it's so well designed and it feels like, you're getting a movie that is not going down that path that so many of these movies tend to when it comes to, the cloak and dagger aspect of it all and the, shadowy figures and, feeling like you always have to look over your shoulder because somebody's, watching you or you're being recorded. And we've seen those movies before and we've seen them done well. We've seen them done poorly. We've seen them, be action movies and more straightforward thrillers. And this kind of leans into kind of more of a straightforward, real world sort of story where, it almost could play, like I could see you following this character like in another movie or series or franchise in terms of him helping other people. But there's just something where it's like, okay, well, it's following this line and this path that has never that never falls apart, and then all of a sudden it loses confidence in itself, and it's almost like we need to give the audience like, a little bit of like an adrenaline rush or a kick or something like that. And it's unfortunate.
I absolutely agree. But again, definitely worth a watch when it comes out. I think, we might be just, I don't know. I'll have to see how other people feel about those last. I think some people will dig some of the stuff in those last 10 minutes. But I think even after we talked it out of like, having to go, wait a minute, does that fully make sense? Blah, 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 blah. And like, I kind of understood what they were going for. I just wish I don't even mind what they do. It's just how they do it. Yeah. Like, it doesn't feel earned and it just feels kind of like, you fell into those
It doesn't
traps.
feel
like,
thought out, right? Because everything else does feel like everything has been completely, analyzed in like every single, possible outcome in a situation. And they know how to play the game, and Riz Ahmed knows how to, sort of always be one step ahead of any situation. But then all of a sudden it feels like the movie, takes a backseat to, its own filmmaking. And it's like, okay, well, let's go on autopilot.
Absolutely agree. Okay, well, that's it for this one, everyone. Thank you all for listening. Please go check out our other reviews on Untitled Movie Podcasts on YouTube and podcast services. You can follow us on Letterboxd at Untitled_movies, and Eric and I on social medias at Matt Rohrbeck at EM6211. Until next time.
Go ahead.